Good morning, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies for those of you who just suffered grievous oral damage. It's a great honor to greet you today and to have the opportunity to address you. Go ahead and I'd like to thank European Students for Liberty for their tremendous hospitality. Again, it's an extraordinary honor to address you, and I hope you'll enjoy the show. Go ahead. What I'd like to do is to give you a little information about me, although the very gracious introduction doesn't leave me a lot to say. Then I'd like to make a couple of general points about how advocates for liberty can do a better job of selling liberty. And then I'd like to give you some examples of how matters of public policy, the libertarian perspective, perhaps we can improve our ways of explaining public policy issues to people. And then I'll be happy to entertain your questions. As mentioned, I didn't want to have to work for a living, so I became a university professor. I hang my shingle in 2 departments in the engineering school at the University of Virginia. Before that, I was in the Department of Statistics at UVA. I was a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Public Choice when it was still at Virginia Tech, and then I was a visiting fellow in the Center for Research and Government Policy at the University of Rochester. I served as the founder and now serve as advisor to Students for Individual Liberty and the Liberty Coalition at the University of Virginia. I'm on the board of advisors of Students for Liberty. I serve as the chair of the Advocates for Self-Government, and I'm involved with the International Society for Individual Liberty. I do have a passing familiarity with the Libertarian Party in the United States. They couldn't find anyone good, so they got stuck with me as chair for a couple of years. I'm on the Libertarian National Committee and am still fairly actively involved. Go ahead. I put this up here because I'm kind of proud of this. The Libertarian Party has 3 national awards, and I'm the only one who's won all 3 of them. And I'll admit I'm very proud of that. So I put it up there. A couple of general points about the way liberty activists make the case. Very simple points, but I don't think we can repeat it often enough. We of liberty disposition must set the highest standards of intellectual integrity. Intellectual sloppiness is no more appealing when it comes from our friends than when it comes from those with whom we think we disagree. We have to set the highest standards of integrity. We must apply the same withering scrutiny to our own ideas that we apply to the ideas of others. Second point, remarkably simple, treat people with courtesy and respect. I've found that most people are pretty decent. If you treat them with courtesy and respect, they'll usually listen to your ideas. And in many cases, the big victories you will win are those where you simply clear away people's misconceptions about what the libertarian perspective is all about. So if you treat people the right way, they'll usually listen to you, and you're capable of moving the ball down the field a very long way. What I'd like to do today is to show you a few things about how matters of public policy are frequently discussed, and to make some points that may be helpful to you in terms of your analysis of public policy ideas and the way you share that analysis with others. I have the honor of serving as a professor in the Department of Systems and Information Engineering, and we pride ourselves on trying to get what we call the big picture about policy issues, to make sure we understand what the real questions are. And in many cases, where liberty loses, it's because people are making decisions without full information, or they haven't really looked carefully at what the real issues are. And I think those of libertarian disposition, we can perform a valuable public service by simply making sure people understand what the real questions are, to understand that perhaps vital information is not being made available to them. I'm going to start off with a very brief discussion of some basic ideas concerning statistics. I teach a lot of statistics classes at the University of Virginia. I have a position in the Department of Statistics. And so I'd like to share some ideas. Maybe you already know this stuff, in which case I'll bore you to tears. I apologize in advance. When we talk about matters in statistics, If we're interested in an idea, for example, a numerical property of some population, whether it's the defect rate of computer chips in a batch of computer chips, or whether it's the average income in a group of people, or perhaps it's the 85th percentile of people who have achieved a certain level of education, we're talking about something called a parameter. A parameter is simply a numerical property of some family, some population of interest. We use statistics to estimate population parameters. In some cases, we may be able to ascertain population parameters with certainty, in which case estimation is not necessary. But frequently, we have to estimate values, and we use statistics to estimate population parameters. Go ahead. And for example, I use the notion of defective chips in a batch of computer chips. If the percentage of defective chips that is defective, if that's what we wish to ascertain, that's called a parameter. And if we're trying to figure out what that parameter is, if the testing mechanism destroys all of your computer chips, you're probably not going to try to find the proportion precisely. You need to find ways of estimating it. So again, what we do is we form statistics. We take values, we take data, and we form something called a statistic, which is, in mathematical terms, it's a function of a random sample that we use to estimate population parameters. And again, very simply, let's say that I want to find average age of UVA undergraduates, and I go out and I interview 5 students. If their ages are as follows, the so-called sample mean is just simply the average of those ages, and I get a particular value. Go ahead. The sample mean is what we call a statistic. It's a function of those data. And in some cases, we'll have a variety of statistics that will be of use to us. Particularly when we're dealing with income distributions, we may find it more useful to use the notion of a median, which is basically the value that sits in the middle. Half the data are below that value, half the data are above that value. All right. In many cases, again, with public policy questions, people are interested in looking at parameter values. What's the average income distribution in the United States? What are the various quantiles or quintiles of income distribution? Of course, for those of you who followed the American political scene, we have a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination, Senator Sanders, who is talking about issues of income inequality. Well, we have to have some idea. If we actually want to pursue what he's saying, we actually have to have some idea of what sort of data are we talking about. So when we're looking at these things, in many cases, when we're trying to make comparisons, for example, whether or not one group is disadvantaged in terms of their ability to earn income, we will frequently use statistics to try to make comparisons. But we have to be very careful when we do this, because if we're looking at 2 populations that are very different in terms of their so-called distribution, we may actually end up not only not getting useful information, we may actually get information that is actually misleading. It's actually information that takes us in the wrong direction. For example, in the United States, a major political point for several years has been the fact that men and women are adjudged to be earning different amounts of money, in some cases, for the same job. And frequently, what is put forward is there's a statistic that's put forward that says, say, women make on average 79 cents for every dollar earned by men. All right, go ahead. And there's an organization called the American Association of University Women, and they had a website where they had the female character Batwoman, a very lovely lady who had tremendous powers. This website said, go and watch the website and show how Batgirl fights ticketing time bombs for college-educated women earning just 67 cents. Now, I point out that this website no longer exists because perhaps people like me pointed out that there were problems with the website. If you're looking at populations that are very different in their characteristics, if you use statistics in a simple-minded fashion, you may come to a conclusion that is completely the opposite of what actually is true. For example, if you're looking at differences in means, if you just take statistics, you may come up with something that's very misleading. Please go ahead. Let's consider 2 groups of people, Alice, Betty, and Kathy, Art, Bob, and Charlie. Let's assume that Alice, Art, and Bob are engineers, whereas Betty, Kathy, and Charlie happen to be teachers. Let's assume that male teachers are paid $40,000 per year, female teachers are paid $50,000. Let's assume that male engineers are paid $100,000 a year and female engineers are paid $125,000. And by the way, as a matter of fact, in academia in the United States, from what I can tell, women actually are paid a premium. These numbers are not out of line with what I've observed, at least recently. Now, you'll notice with these numbers, women are paid a premium. Women are paid 25% higher. But if we look at the average salaries, the average salary for women is $75,000 per year. The average salary for men is $80,000, even though women are paid a 25% premium. If you compare job by job, women are actually being discriminated in favor, but the average for women is actually lower. Now again, this is a very simple point for a hip audience like you all. I know I'm probably telling you something you already know, but for many people who deal with public policy questions, this point sometimes escapes them, that when you're looking at very different populations in terms of their distribution, in the case here, men are 2 to 1 more likely to be engineers, women are 2 to 1 more likely to be teachers. So even though you might have positive discrimination in favor of women, 25% premium, the averages are different. So again, I've just go ahead and made the point here. Another example, when you're looking at economic data, say with populations, say that might be discriminated against, if you are looking at different ages in terms of the populations, this could have, again, a misleading impact if you were just to look at simple statistics. Because if one population, if the average or median age is considerably greater than that of the other population, typically, as people get older, as they go from, say, 20 to 50 to 55, their income tends to increase. Now, of course, at retirement age, they reach a backbending part where their income will decline. But if you have two populations that have very different age distributions, simply looking at averages is likely to be very misleading. Another example, and this is one, again, in the United States, we have a lot of discussion about the nature of our healthcare system. Frequently, people point out that other countries that have much greater government involvement with their healthcare system, may have lower average costs. Okay? Again, you have to look very carefully at what is the nature of the distribution. If one country, for example, go ahead, if one country happens to have a much higher percentage of elderly people tend to be greater consumers of healthcare dollars. In fact, it's been suggested that at least within the United States, by far the largest amount of health care that you will demand in terms of dollars will come in the last year of your life, because perhaps heroic methods are being adopted to treat you for some dread disease. And by the way, wealthy countries, we have a higher preference for health care because we can afford it. So again, if you take simple statistics and you say that one country may have lower average healthcare costs, and you don't take into account that you may have very different distributions, you may come to very, very misleading conclusions about the nature of the healthcare. Now again, I hope I'm making a point with which you're already familiar, that you understand that you must employ considerable care when comparing different populations, heterogeneous populations. But unfortunately, in many cases, public policy discussion takes place as if many of those advocating for, say, government policies don't seem to understand some very simple points. All right, again, one point if you're dealing with populations is you may have the problem of outliers. And the classic example, go ahead please. The classic example is, I teach at the University of Virginia School of Engineering, but I'm a Virginia Tech alumnus. The two schools are great rivals. If you look at the income data, say for UVA undergraduates, where you have one person who received $1 million salary, and we did have an example like this because we had a young man who played professional baseball. He was a very good baseball player, and baseball pitchers get very high salaries. If you look at the data for the UVA School of Engineering and then compare it to the Virginia Tech data, you'll see that the average, go ahead and advance the screen please, you'll see that the average for the University of Virginia is much higher. However, most of the engineers at Virginia Tech are making a higher salary. So if you're using simple statistics such as the sample mean, you may get a very misleading impression. That's why in many cases when people look at income data, they prefer to look at the median, or they prefer to look at quantiles or quintiles. In other words, they tend to stratify the data into the lowest quarter, the next quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter. All right, and so, yeah, go ahead. All right, the next issue I refer to as different strokes, and that is when we're looking at trying to gain information from data about different populations, we have to make sure that we're gathering the same type of data. Incidentally, people use data, the words data and the word information synonymously. Data and information are not necessarily the same thing. You gather data to provide information. You take information from data. Data don't necessarily tell you anything. You use data to get information. Again, in my country, the United States, frequently people compare the quality of healthcare in the United States by looking at various statistics. The Centers for Disease Control a few years ago said that the United States ranked 29th with respect to infant mortality, and we lagged Cuba. Now, I don't think too many people look to Cuba as a great exemplar of healthcare, but this datum was used as an example to show that the United States healthcare system was lagging in important ways. Well, I'm not sure that this is a valid comparison, because in many cases, we may be comparing apples and oranges. For example, in the United States, the definition of what constitutes a live birth is very different from what other countries use. We use the WHO definition that babies showing any sign of life, as indicated here, muscle activity, heartbeat, and so forth. Go ahead, if you would advance it, please. That's all right. Okay, but other countries use very different definitions. So you must be very careful to make sure that your comparisons actually are comparing the right things. Now, I mention this because I think there's a natural tendency for people to assume, when we hear discussions about matters of this sort, to assume that people have already made the valid comparisons, that they've actually sorted out what is being compared. And in some cases, we don't necessarily pick up on the fact that the comparisons that are being made, comparisons that frequently serve to the detriment of the market liberal, free market, libertarian perspective, that in many cases, people are debating things that are not true. And we have to be attentive to be sure that when the debate takes place, people are making valid comparisons. Okay, again, I think there's a natural assumption that we assume the proper comparisons are being made, and that may not be true at all. All right, a related issue, and this is one, I love to drive automobiles. I like to drive them real fast. In the United States, many years, when I was first starting to drive, the federal government basically imposed a restriction on the ability of people to drive, basically saying you can only drive 55, the speed limit must be 55 on state highways. The highway department in New Mexico had to deal with the issue of, are they enforcing the speed limit properly? If they didn't enforce it, according to the federal government, they might lose their highway funds. So why do I mention this? Well, if you've been driving in the state of New Mexico, which is a big state, nobody drove 55 miles an hour unless they were accelerating through it or decelerating to a stop. They changed tires at 55 miles an hour in New Mexico. So if you are trying to gather data to show that you're in compliance with the speed limit, you know you're not going to get compliance because nobody in New Mexico was driving so slowly. In fact, if you were driving 55, people would go out of their way to run you off the road because you were a road hazard. But if you're trying to figure out how could we gather data that would show we're in compliance without actually doping the data, where you actually change the speeds at which people were recorded going, how might you do it? Well, what you might do is you might have a speed sensing device here, and you might park a police car right by the sensing device. Or you put your sensing devices in places where the traffic is so heavy that nobody's going to be going faster than the speed limit. Now, why do I mention this? Because in many cases, it is very difficult to determine how are the data being gathered, and that people are being asked to make comparisons, they're being asked to make judgments on data that may not have been gathered with scrupulous integrity. And again, I'm not referring to situations where people go in and literally take an eraser and change the data, but they're not scrupulous in how those data have gathered. And in many cases with public policy, people who perhaps are in favor of greater government involvement may not be quite so scrupulous in making sure that the proper data collection methods have been observed. Go ahead and advance it. Another issue is global warming. Now, I happen to be something of an agnostic on the issue of global warming. I think that there is a human signal in the warming we've observed. I don't know how great that signal is. I don't know how dangerous it's going to be. So I'm not sure. However, when people talk about things such as temperature going up, what do they mean? You can have various ways of measuring increases in temperature. What do you actually mean? For example, we could measure the maximum temperature on a daily basis. We might measure the maximum temperature each year. We might measure the difference between the maximum and minimum every day. We might measure temperature at various times during each day and then take some sort of average. There are many ways in which you might measure temperature, and depending upon which means you have adopted to measure, the implications for policy may be very, very different. A friend of mine, Pat Michaels, who was the former state climatologist in Virginia, one of the foremost academic skeptics of the apocalyptic view of global warming, said that depending upon what type of warming is occurring, we might go from either very bad consequences to, frankly, very helpful consequences. So again, when we're trying to address public policy concerns, we need to be sure what we're actually measuring, what we're looking at. Framing the question. In so many cases, how you frame the issue will determine what answer people will come to. Classic example, this is framing bias issue. I mentioned highway safety laws. Again, this is an issue of great interest to me. If you frame a question about highway safety laws as, should we adopt a law that will save an estimated 7,466 lives per year, even though it may require drivers to spend roughly an additional 30% time on the road? If you frame the issue in that fashion, you would draw very substantial support for such a law. If you change the way it is framed to what I have here, should we adopt a law that over the lifetime of an individual reduce the estimated probability an individual will die in a traffic accident from 0.0005 to 0.0004, even though it may require more time on the road? The support for that law goes down precipitously. The first framing of the issue, you get substantial majority support. The second framing of the issue, you get very low support, but it's the same law. Should we have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on federal highways? It's the same law. How you frame the issue will in many cases determine the answer. And it is very important for those of classical libertarian disposition to make sure that when public policy issues are discussed, people understand the implications. So it's important for us to make sure those issues are framed properly. Comparing now and tomorrow. This is a simple point. Again, I hope all of you already understand this, but the notion of present value. In many cases, when people talk, say, about a government program that is going to have many benefits, it's not clear how they're commensurating now with the future. We have a tool, a mathematical tool called present value, that allows us to commensurate value of dollars today and value of dollars in the future. I take it as axiomatic that a dollar in my hand right now is worth more than the promise of a dollar in the future. Because the world could change, the world could end between now and the future. So I take it as axiomatic that a dollar in hand is intrinsically more valuable than the promise of a dollar in the future. And this lends us to the notion of present value. And the mathematical way of putting this is, if you've got a stream of revenues, X0, X1, so forth, we can calculate what we call a present value. This is a way of trying to take cash flows in the future and giving them a value now. What would you be willing to give up now in exchange for this series of streams? And in many cases, when we're talking about the benefits, the putative benefits of government programs, it's not clear that those advocates of those programs are calculating present value. What are we actually looking at? Go ahead. For example, let's say that you're talking about winning a lottery, and the lottery will pay you $50,000 a year if you win over 20 years. And I make some assumptions about when the first payment is realized. And let's assume that you take what's referred to as a 5% interest rate. You could invest your money at 5% per year. The present value of winning the lottery, if you use what's called a 5% discount rate, is only a little over $623,000. The idea is you would not want to give up, and when you're trying to commensurate the stream of cash flows, $50,000 over 20 years, how much would you be willing to receive today in exchange for that cash flow? Well, this is a way of gauging that amount. It's a way of comparing the now with the future. And in many cases, when we talk about government programs, you may go ahead and advance the slide, please, it's not at all clear whether people who are advocating for government programs are giving us proper present value analysis. Okay. And I've already made that point, I'm sorry. Okay, so when we're trying to, again, look at the issue of comparing what we have now versus the future, we need to be very careful that we're always discussing using common terms. And we need to be willing to actually estimate what are the present value of these programs. Okay, go ahead. This is one of my favorites. When I teach at the University of Virginia, I always use this example of the TV program Risk, where you as a contestant, you can go on the TV program and you push a button, and there's a randomizing device that will give you a reward if the green light flashes and a not reward if the red light flashes. Go ahead. If the green light flashes, you win $1 million. If the red light flashes, you suffer horrible death. The way the game is played, you as the contestant, you get to set the probability that the green light flashes with the following proviso. You cannot make P, the probability of a green light, equal to 1. In other words, you cannot have certainty that you will win the reward. There has to be a residual probability that you're going to suffer a horrible death. How many of you would play this game? You could set P at 0.9, 0.99, 0.999, but you have to truncate. How many of you would play the game? I knew I liked this crowd. Well, let's say a few months go by. The novelty of seeing people slaughtered in horrible ways has sort of worn off. So now the game show, they have to reduce the reward from $1 million to $1,000. You still play the game in the same way, but now the reward is only $1,000. How many of you would play the game? I noticed far fewer hands went up. Well, let's say that a few months go by and the show is really becoming somewhat unpopular, Now they're only willing to pay $1. Now how many of you would play the game? Okay, this response is typical. Allow me to suggest, you may advance the slides. Allow me to suggest you play this game every day. You just don't frame the issue in this fashion. You do things literally every day that subject you to the probability, a non-zero probability, of horrible death. Worse, you play a game in which your actions subject you to a non-zero probability you may cause someone else's death. But we don't frame the issue in this fashion. Issues of risk and reward are extremely important in matters of public policy. Governments frequently undertake regulations with, I think in many cases, the best of intentions to protect us from risk. In my country, we have something called the Food and Drug Administration, which has police powers to regulate what you put in your body for your health, your safety, and your comfort. It is possible that the Food and Drug Administration, operating with the best of intentions, may have killed more people than it has protected. Why? Because it has the power to keep drugs off the market, drugs that may actually be very helpful to a large fraction of those who would use those drugs. Yes, such a given drug might be very harmful, perhaps deadly, to a small part of a population, but keeping that drug off the market may kill millions. And in many cases, the victims will not know who they are. Please advance. Okay, a couple of important points. Go back. When we're discussing public policy issues, it is important to make sure we're comparing apples to oranges and not apples to rocks. If we want to compare apples to apples, we have to be scrupulous to make sure we're making the valid comparisons. Another point of analysis. Typically, the benefits of government action, whatever they may be, are highly visible, and the beneficiaries are visible, and they know who they are. The victims of government action may be far larger in terms of numbers. The cost of government action may be vastly greater in aggregate, but those costs in many cases are difficult, if not impossible, to measure, and the victims may be invisible. They may not know who they are. We may have buried them, and they'll never know who they are. Again, it is a great honor to address you. Thank you very much for taking your valuable time to be at this conference. My email address is jwlark@virginia.edu. If I can be of any assistance to you, if you found what I happen to say to be interesting, please let me know. I've got an ego. I like it when people say nice things about me.